Good afternoon and a warm welcome to everyone joining us this evening for this webinar with Sarah Hampton on environmental influences on anxiety and depression in young people. Here at the Centre for Research in Autism and Education, we're a team of autistic and non-autistic staff and students based within UCL's Institute of Education and part of the Department of Psychology and Human Development. Through everything we do at CRAE, we take a participatory approach, which means we work with autistic people in all stages of our research and initiatives, from the initial design right through to the sharing of outcomes. We hope this means that the work that we do is meaningful for the wider autistic community. We aim to conduct high quality, cutting edge research, but also to ensure that the results of that research reach those who stand to benefit from it. This CRAE webinar series is part of this, allowing people to hear from some of the key researchers, practitioners and advocates in the field. And at this point, I'd like to say a big thank you to our funders, supporters and team members who contribute to our work to make it all possible. In particular, a special thank you to Pears Foundation for their generous ongoing support that underpins everything that we do. As always, we invite you to become part of the conversation, either in the chat or with more anonymity, I said it this time, in the Q&A. We'll stop recording at this point and we'll endeavour to have as many questions answered as we can by Sarah. Today, we are thrilled to have the brilliant Sarah Hampton with us. Sarah is a postdoctoral researcher here at University College London. She has a range of research interests, including autistic people's healthcare experiences and the experience of autistic women and girls. She takes a neurodiversity affirming approach to her research. She has an interest in participatory methods and aims to centre the priorities of those with lived experience in her research. Sarah, it's over to you.
Thank you so much, Brian, for that introduction, and thank you to everyone for coming along. Okay, I'm going to attempt to share my screen now. Is it working all okay?
That's looking brilliant, Sarah. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you everyone for joining. So I'm going to talk a bit today about a study that myself and colleagues at UCL have been working on about environmental influences on anxiety and depression in autistic young people. Okay, so I thought I would start off by just saying a little bit more about me and my background, just so you can get a bit of an idea of my positionality and the approach that I'm taking into this research. So as I mentioned, I'm a postdoctoral researcher and my background is mostly in kind of qualitative psychology and healthcare research. And I'm also neurodivergent, so I'm autistic and I have ADHD. And I've received diagnoses of both autism and ADHD quite recently, so within the last few years. So I'm bringing a kind of personal lived experience perspective to my research as well as a professional. And the work that I do tends to be situated in the neurodiversity paradigm. So I'll talk a little bit more about that paradigm later, but for me, this mostly means that I kind of see neurodivergent conditions like autism as part of the natural variation in how people experience the world, rather than as simply deficits. So it's not to minimise the very real challenges associated with being autistic, but just to say that we also have strengths as well as challenges, and that some of our challenges can come from things like societal barriers, not just sort of individual impairments. So that's the kind of perspective that I'm coming from with this research. Okay, and so just to say a bit more about the kind of background to this topic. So we know that autistic people have a high chance of developing a broad range of different mental health issues and are at least 3 times more likely than non-autistic people to develop anxiety and depression. And we know that both among the autistic and non-autistic populations, anxiety and depression often first arise quite early in life, often by adolescence, and they can have really detrimental effects in people's lives. So we know generally that anxiety and depression can significantly impact quality of life and well-being, day-to-day functioning, sleep, physical health, and also kind of have impacts on mortality, for example, through associations with increased risk of suicide. So it's really imperative that autistic people have access to effective support for anxiety and depression. And support for these conditions has been consistently highlighted by the autistic community as a top priority for research. Despite the importance of the topic, there's a real lack of effective interventions for anxiety and depression among autistic people. And support designed for non-autistic people tends to be a bit less effective for autistic people. And this might in part be because some of the underlying causes of anxiety and depression might differ between autistic and non-autistic people. And at the moment, we don't have a particularly good evidence-based understanding of why anxiety and depression first develop in autistic people, why they persist, and what can help to reduce them. And in particular, we really like an evidence-based understanding of environmental risk and protective factors. And so by environmental factors, I just mean any kind of external influences on the individuals. That could be the social environment, the physical environment, and so on. Okay, so why are environmental factors important? So, so the medical model of disability has historically been the dominant way of thinking about autism and other neurodivergent conditions. And this model traditionally tends to assume that there's a particular kind of typical way that people's brains work, and that brains that work differently from those are kind of distorted in some way. So there can be a tendency to see autistic characteristics as deficits, and that can mean that research done within that framework can tend to focus a bit more on individual kind of characteristics and deficits rather than considering the individual's context. So a lot of the research into anxiety and depression in autistic people has tended to look at individual characteristics. So things like the ability to tolerate uncertain situations, ability to understand one's own emotions, tendencies towards things like repetitive thinking and rumination. And these factors definitely are relevant and important, but they don't necessarily take into account the person's kind of broader context. So the ways in which those characteristics might interact with the environment around the individual, and things like broader experiences like stigma and discrimination within society and so on. And so this focus on the individual's characteristics can mean that research tends to focus on changing the individual rather than changing the world around them. And the neurodiversity model tends to shift focus away from those individual deficits towards thinking about the individual's context and creating environments that can accommodate diverse ways of being and allow people to thrive on their own terms. And one way of thinking about the environment and its relationship to the individual is ecological systems theory. So in this model, there's a series of nested systems in a person's environment that interact with each other and influence the individual's development. So there's an individual in the middle there, and they have the microsystem around them. So that's their immediate environment. So things like family, school, and peers. There's a mesosystem, that's interactions between different parts of the microsystem. I'm thinking a bit broader, the exosystem, so things that sort of a bit more indirectly influence the individual, like extended family, community resources, and so on. And then there's the macrosystem, so this broader kind of cultural and social context. And finally, the chronosystem, so it's the impact of kind of time and life events on the individual, so things like life transitions, historical events. So this model really emphasises that development isn't only determined by individual characteristics, but also the interplay of these kinds of environmental systems, and highlights the importance of considering the individual's broader social and cultural context. So in this study, we're focusing on understanding how interactions between the autistic individual and their environment give rise to anxiety and depression during childhood and adolescence. And we're focusing on these factors in part because we think it's quite likely that environmental factors, school or parenting, might influence autistic people's mental health. And these factors generally tend to influence people's mental health in the general population. So we think that autistic lives should be understood in context rather than looking at the individual in isolation. And also, a lot of potential environmental risk and protective factors could be modifiable. So things like parenting or the built environment, for example, are things that could be changed, and therefore they could be quite promising targets for interventions. And they might actually be more appropriate targets than something like individual characteristics, which could be a bit more difficult to change. So as well as focusing on environmental factors in this study, we're also focusing on lived experience. This is because we currently don't know very much about how autistic people experience anxiety and depression from a kind of first-hand perspective. So among the non-autistic population, there's evidence that various environmental factors like bullying, parental mental health, socioeconomic factors can all play a role in the development of anxiety and depression in young people. And there's some evidence that these factors can play a role for autistic young people as well. But a lot of the research that's been done so far has tended to be kind of cross-sectional quantitative research. So we don't have a lot of kind of qualitative evidence that's sort of asking autistic people about their first-hand experiences. And the qualitative experience that research that does exist has tended to focus more on parents' views and perspectives, more so than young people themselves. And it's really important that we do hear from autistic young people as they can give valuable insights about their experience that could help inform more effective support. So that's what we're focusing on in the study. Okay, so the study that I'm talking about today is part of a broader ESRC-funded study that's called the Mental Health and Wellbeing of Autistic Young People, or the MWAY study. So the study has 3 different phases to it. So the first one is a qualitative interview phase, and that's what I'll mostly be talking about today. So in that phase, we've interviewed autistic young people and their parents, exploring experiences of anxiety and depression. And we're now just transitioning into phase 2, which is a quantitative phase. So we're drawing upon national cohort studies to conduct a programme of longitudinal quantitative work, which will be exploring environmental influences on anxiety and depression in autistic young people. And in between these 2 phases, the qualitative and the quantitative, we have a bridging phase, and we've just completed this phase. And so it's been a process of structured consultation with autistic young people and other stakeholders, where we've presented the findings from the qualitative interviews and use them as a basis for discussions to shape concrete research questions to be tested in phase 2 of the study. And the project has been shaped throughout by a panel of autistic young people and a panel of adult stakeholders. Now, probably a little bit more about these. So we have a panel of, we have a young person's advisory group, which consists of autistic young people aged 13 to 18 years. And we also have an adult stakeholder group, and that includes autistic adults, but also parents, clinicians, researchers, policymakers. And the panels have been advising the research throughout the whole study, including things like research questions, methods, analysis, dissemination. And we also have a study blog, and our members of our Young Persons Advisory Group often contribute to the blog and like guest blog posts. So we did a post a little while ago about why do we need participatory research into autistic young people's mental health. And this is just a quote from one of the members of our Young Persons group. And she says that, you know, she suffered a lot from both anxiety and depression, and this was largely because of the toxic environment cultivated in schools. Even for non-autistic students, the most pivotal developmental years of one's life can be held. It's important to take into account autistic young people's views. So she's just really highlighting here, like the importance of looking at these kind of environmental factors, and also the importance of talking to autistic young people about their own views. So moving on to the interview methods, so we did semi-structured quantitative interviews with 20 autistic young people aged 10 to 18. We also did interviews with 30 parents of autistic young people. These were mostly the parents of the young people who we interviewed. And we also had another group of parents of slightly younger children aged 5 to 9. So all of the young people had a prior diagnosis or current experience of anxiety or depression, and we defined current experience as scoring above the cutoff on the emotional problems scale of the Strengths and Difficulties questionnaire. All of the participants were based in the UK, and they were recruited via autism charities and organisations, and also sort of smaller local parent groups and youth groups schools and social media. So in terms of demographics of young people, the mean age was around 12, and the mean age at receiving an autism diagnosis was around 8. There were 16 girls, 15 boys, and 1 non-binary person. Most of the sample was from a white ethnic background, but we talked to people from a range of different ethnicities. Most of the young people were in mainstream school, 5 in specialist school, 3 not in education. And to assess socioeconomic background, we used the index of multiple deprivation. So that uses a range of indicators to assess the relative deprivation of different areas in England. So 1 here is areas that are the most deprived, and 5 is the least deprived. So most of the people who we spoke to were from the sort of 4th and 5th quintile. So that's some of the least deprived areas in the UK. And interview topics covered the nature of anxiety and depression, so what anxiety and depression felt like for the young person, the impact that it had on their life, the development of anxiety and depression over time for them, and what they thought might be kind of causal factors, and also protective factors, so what they felt helped. And before young people took part, we had a kind of introductory chat with them, in which we established things like informed consent, also preferred ways of working, and just any ways that we could make young people feel really comfortable in the interviews. And we wanted to try and make the interviews as inclusive as we could. We offered for young people to take part however they felt comfortable. So some took part in person, others by a video call, and they could have their cameras on or off if they wanted to. Some took part by phone call, email, or chat messages. They could have a trusted person present, so many of the young people had a parent present with them. And they could talk about something that helps explain how they feel. So that could be something like a drawing that they've done, or a photograph they've taken, or really any kind of interest that they have, so something like a TV show. So just anything that might help sort of shape the discussion a bit more and help them to feel a bit more comfortable talking. We offered for them to take lots of breaks and try to create an environment in which they felt comfortable to stim and move around however they can feel comfortable. And these methods were kind of influenced by feedback from our young person's advisory group. And then analysing the data, we used framework analysis. So we developed a kind of coding framework as a team in collaboration with one of our young stakeholders. And this framework was based on kind of categories of environmental variables that we thought might impact wellbeing. And we coded all of the transcripts from each of the interviews according to this framework, and then summarised each of the transcripts. Again, that was in collaboration with another one of our young stakeholders. And then we generated sort of themes together as a team. And throughout, we've kind of shared preliminary interview findings with our stakeholder panels as well, and got feedback on them as we've gone along. Okay, so we came up with 3 themes in total. So demands and expectations, autonomy and control, and safety, trust and predictability. So the first thing, demands and expectations. So the first sub-theme here is pressures of the school system. So school had a very large impact for the young people who we spoke to. It often represented a really pressurizing kind of environment. So this young person says, you know, I'm dreading going back to school in September. I hate being overwhelmed all day with no relief. I have no downtime, which makes me feel very tired and anxious. I like school, but it's just too overwhelming and constant. And this was quite a common experience, that young people found school a really overwhelming environment and could often have a marked improvement in their well-being during school holidays, and then a marked deterioration again when they went back to school. And academic pressure at school was one of the main sources of stress at the young people at school. So things like anxiety around the pressures of exams and frequent testing. And these anxieties were kind of common to young people of various different kind of academic abilities, but were particularly heightened for the young people for whom academic demands were not very attuned to their needs. So some people talked about, the work just being too difficult and the pacing not being appropriate for their needs. And this parent of a young person says, he's got low self-esteem, which you can understand. If you're struggling to do the work and you're struggling in that environment, you always feel like you're failing. Why am I not like everyone else? It's quite a hard place to be. So this was quite a common experience of this sort of academic pressure really impacting young people's self-esteem, as they could be aware that they might be struggling a bit more than their peers and feel quite sort of self-conscious about that. And school was often quite an inflexible environment as well. So there were often quite strict kind of discipline policies, so things like exclusion, detention, a couple of the young people experienced restraint, and that could be really overwhelming for the young people. And there were also often quite strict rules. So schools could have things like strict policies around uniforms, inflexible timetables, strict attendance policies, or strict rules around toilet use. So this young person on the left talks about, my school is very strict on attendance, but I can't help that I'm ill, that I've injured myself, or that I need a bit of extra support. And they're not very sympathetic, and that annoys me so much. So she kind of really felt like that sort of strict attendance policy was kind of a barrier to having her emotional needs met around school. And so there's a quote as well from a parent of a young person who says that the school environment is very rule-based, so her daughter did exactly what she was told. Because she spent 6 hours a day doing that, at the end she'd just explode and she would have suppressed everything the whole day long. And again, this was quite a common experience for young people to find school kind of overwhelming, but sort of mask that throughout the school day and then sort of release that when they got home. So young people could often find it very challenging to get the accommodations and support that they needed. And this could be particularly the case in mainstream school, with specialist schools sometimes being a bit more appropriate for their needs. And some young people described having a kind of crisis point that they felt perhaps could have been avoided if they'd received the kind of support that they needed from schools at an earlier stage. And these difficulties at school often sort of increased with age, with increasing demands. So the transition to secondary school was often particularly challenging. And for some, their issues around anxiety and depression could first become apparent at those times of transition, when there's increasing pressures. Okay, so moving on to the next sub-themes, that's social demands and pressures. So young people felt pressure to fit in and socialise in neurotypical ways across various different contexts. This was probably most apparent with peers. So young people could feel like they didn't always understand the social norms of their neurotypical peers. So this young person says, I find social situations really hard. Everyone seems to have read a guidebook that I haven't, and they all understand each other. And young people could often experience misunderstandings with their peers, which could be very upsetting and confusing for them. And it could mean that it was difficult to make and maintain friendships, and that could lead to feelings of isolation and loneliness. And young people would often internalise these misunderstandings as them having made a social mistake. And that's something that they could sort of ruminate on and dissect, and that could be very tiring for them. So young people sometimes struggle to fit in with their peers, and this could leave them feeling quite excluded and isolated. So this young person talks about, the girls are not like me. If I wasn't autistic, then I would be like the girls. I don't know how to dress correctly. They make fun of me. So as this quote illustrates, some young people could be quite aware that they're different due to being autistic and could worry about how they're then perceived by others. And there was potentially a bit of an interaction with gender here. So these sorts of worries tended to be a bit more common among girls, so worrying about kind of fitting in with the popular girls, for example. And girls as well could be a bit more likely to have concerns around things like body image and concerns around kind of knowing how to look the right way. And some young people talked about experiencing bullying from peers. So this young person says, you know, my life's been ruined because of that. People bullying us, making us upset, making us cry. They pick on me because I've got special needs. They pick on me because I think I'm autistic. They just pick on me. I don't know why they want to pick on me. So as with this young person, a few of the young people could feel that they were targeted in terms of bullying due to being autistic and being different. And these experiences could sometimes make people feel like they needed to kind of keep a low profile and fit in more. And some could kind of analyse which behaviours they should and shouldn't do based on the reactions that they got from their peers. And so relatedly, young people could often feel a kind of pressure to conform and mask their autistic characteristics, which could be really exhausting for them. So this young person says, I was worried that if they perceived me, they wouldn't like who I am, and that's when I first started to mask a little more. And obviously we know that sense of belonging is very important for developing a sense of identity and self-esteem, particularly in the adolescent years. And so young people could often feel a lot more aware of their social differences as they got older, and these kinds of social pressures increase. So this is a drawing by one of the young people who took part in the study, and we've got their permission to include this here. So this quote kind of relates to how they were feeling when they did the drawing. So they say, I was having really bad anxiety about my friends not wanting me around, being able to talk so much without me saying anything. I panicked and drew this to get things out. They do want me around. I just had a really bad moment where I got extremely scared. So this drawing really sort of illustrates this anxiety. And I don't know if you can read here, but there's some sort of drawing, little writings around the person. It says things like, you know, they'll leave me and it'll be my fault, I deserve it. So I think this drawing sort of really gets across the sense of like alienation and isolation that this person was feeling. And they went on in the interview to talk about how valuable art was as a really powerful way, powerful coping strategy when they were feeling anxious and And the third subtheme, this theme is sensory demands. So environments with high sensory demands were often quite overwhelming. So again, school could be quite a challenging environment from this perspective. So young people could struggle with crowded corridors, bright lights, the noisiness of their peers. And this could be particularly true for secondary school. And young people generally really struggled in sort of busy, loud, crowded spaces. Family meal times and social events could be quite difficult from a sensory perspective as well. And young people often really valued kind of lower demand sensory environments, so particularly open spaces and nature. So moving on to theme 2, autonomy and lack of control. So young people could find it really difficult to cope with changes to plans and routines and transitions, particularly when any of these changes were externally imposed. And this parent of an 8-year-old says that her anxiety is mostly related to concern around changes to routine and to environment. Anxiety is minimal when she's comfortable in her environment and knows the routine. And young people really struggled with any kind of environments not under their control. So again, this was quite relevant in the school environment. So school can sometimes represent unpredictability, with young people finding it difficult to adjust to things like unexpected changes to class schedules. They also found it difficult to adapt to getting to know different teachers and their different teaching styles. They could also find disruptive peers at school quite difficult, as it can make the classroom feel quite chaotic and unpredictable. And they could get quite anxious when they could see teachers not be able to control the class appropriately, because it was quite important to them that teachers were able to facilitate a safe and predictable space. And this young person says, you know, like with any sort of new situation, it's completely unknown. I'm starting A-levels, I've got a new subject, it's a completely new teacher, I don't know who's going to be in the classes, I've never been in their classroom before, and that makes me really anxious just because I can't prepare for it. So this is quite a common theme, that these sorts of school-related transitions could be really challenging. So the second sub-theme, importance of autonomy. So sense of autonomy was really important for young people and could help them feel more in control of their environment. So in the school environment, it could be really useful to sort of take the pressure off and increase flexibility. So things like, people benefited from more breaks, reduced timetables, less strict rules around attendance, for example. And it's also been often quite useful to provide like a balance of clear sort of structure and predictability, but also flexibility according to the young person's needs. So this parent talks about he'll go to school in the morning and they'll put out tasks in front of him. So this is what you have to do for the week. It's your choice when you do it. So passing control over to the child. But for a lot of young people, their schools didn't kind of do this, and sometimes could misunderstand young people's needs and end up applying more pressure rather than reducing it. So, for example, adding sort of additional security measures around those children who were struggling a bit more, which could be counterproductive because it just felt like more pressure. And autonomy was also important in the home environment, so parents found it really useful to lower demand and give autonomy to their young person. So this parent says, definitely low demand approach, it's made all the difference in our life. Collaboration, working together, turning your thinking upside down. So being really flexible about parenting. And this generally worked quite well for families, but it could be a bit of a difficult balance for parents of, again, providing that autonomy while also maintaining strong boundaries and structure. And young people also could experience barriers to gaining that sense of autonomy. So, as mentioned before, young people could sometimes feel like they had to adapt to the environment by kind of masking and pleasing others rather than taking control over the environment. And some young people could really worry about sort of doing the right thing and pleasing other people. So this young person says, like, there's a stereotype that if you have autism, you're assessed with trains. I don't have train autism. I have the temporal autism where I feel like I can never be loved and I crave love and validation constantly. And that just connects so many dots for me because I feel like, wow, that's why I'm like this. So this young person talked a lot in their interview about having quite low self-esteem and wanted to sort of please others and get validation from them. And she also talked about the value of having an autism diagnosis, but then understanding herself a bit more. And it was quite common for the young people to feel like that kind of self-understanding provided a bit of a pathway towards a bit more self-acceptance and ultimately kind of feeling a bit more empowered to kind of advocate for themselves and for their autonomy. And young people also talked sometimes about summoning sort of the motivation to face their fears, particularly when there was a goal that they were particularly motivated towards, rather than sort of a goal that those around them wanted. And so this is a quote from a young person who had a really strong interest in the TV show, However Boss and Husband Hotel, which is where this character Bits is from. And he talked to me a lot about how kind of relating to those characters helped him to make sense of his own feelings. So yeah, here he talks about being sort of motivated to overcome his fears of being vulnerable with others to work towards his goal of building sort of meaningful relationships. And I think the quote also illustrates a sort of interesting and common tension that the young people felt of at times having to kind of relinquish control to some extent, such as here sort of yielding to vulnerability, which requires a little bit of letting go of control in order to kind of create a life that worked for them and meet their goals and sort of ultimately have autonomy. So the final theme is safety, trust, and predictability. So people, places, and activities that felt safe and predictable were important protective factors. So this young person says, I've got many people around me who just get it, they've understood me more as a person. And I think that's so crucial for me. So this again was a common experience of young people really valuing feeling understood by other people. So family are often a supportive, safe base for young people. And young people sometimes felt quite comfortable kind of being vulnerable and masking with their families and opening up to them about issues. And parents talked in turn about spending a lot of time trying to work with their young person and help them sort of make sense of and articulate their feelings. And some parents reported thinking that it was very important to kind of foster a positive sense of identity and a positive sort of accepting view of autism in their household. And this tended to be particularly true of parents who themselves identified as neurodivergent. So that's the case here for this parent who says, she feels intense shame about her behaviour and she's internalized her struggles with her personality by feeling like there's something wrong with her. So it was really trying to rebuild her self-esteem. And parents also strive to provide kind of routine and structure and predictability for their young people to sort of build that sense of safety, but also kind of scaffolding growth. So also trying to encourage them out of their comfort zone where appropriate. And while parents were generally a safe place for young people, some young people did experience separation anxiety when away from their parents and can struggle with being sort of left alone at home, for example. And this was sort of exacerbated when there were difficult family circumstances like parental illness. And some young people did experience some really sort of challenging family circumstances. So things like parental separation, being taken into care, parental addiction, bereavement in the family. And they're kind of events that would be challenging for any young person. But there was potentially sort of an extra layer of difficulty for the autistic young people due to these events just being quite unpredictable in nature. So young people also valued trusted professionals, including teachers. So they really appreciated teachers who understood their needs and respected the accommodations that they needed. And having a trusted adult at school who they felt really kind of emotionally safe with could be really helpful for helping them to genuinely feel more at ease at school. And forming those sorts of bonds could, again, be a bit easier during specialist settings and mainstream environments. So this young person had just moved to a specialist school and says, I can form bonds with the teachers better. They all have training on how to deal with children with additional needs, which is a lot better because in mainstream school they didn't really understand. And young people also sort of value trusted mental health professionals. And a lot of the young people did find it very challenging to get access to the right kinds of support. So facing things like really long CAMHS waiting lists, for example, or being refused support by CAMHS. And when they did get to see mental health professionals, they didn't always feel understood or listened to by them. So sometimes I could feel that kind of professionals didn't always have the best understanding of autism or the best knowledge about how to adapt to their practice and really take into account the interactions between autism and mental health. A couple of the young people had access to a neurodivergent therapist, which did seem to facilitate perhaps a bit more sort of building of rapport and understanding. Yeah, and so this young person again sort of says they just don't listen. They're very tick box. Like I just feel like another person that they've got to get to know. So that feeling of not really feeling heard or listened to. And young people did report a few barriers to building those kind of connections. So things like therapists using kind of neurotypical communication styles, and also the really short time scales of therapy, because that can be a real barrier as young people needed some time to get to know and open up with a new person. So they could often feel quite self-conscious and reluctant to sort of unmask and be vulnerable with professionals. So the next subtheme, places and activities. So places and activities could provide a sense of sanctuary, allow for meaningful and joyful experiences. They were often a respite from kind of just responding to external demands. And so home and especially the bedroom were commonly felt to be a safe space. So it could represent a less pressurizing setting where young people could have a bit more control over their environment, where they could feel comfortable to unmask. And some young people could sort of reported sort of coping better with challenging things, such as changes to routine, when they were in this sort of environment where they felt a bit more safe. So this young person talks about, at home, without doubt, at home is where I know everything is. I think that's why I like it, because I just know everything's in place, wherever everyone is, what everyone's doing. At home or the park, they're my favourite places to be. And online environments could also be an important space for young people. They often found it easier to socialise online, as it took away a lot of the pressures of in-person socialising. So young people talked making some really successful friendships online, though they could also have difficulties in falling out with friends online too. Nature and open spaces were often associated with a sense of calm and sanctuary, young people often enjoy sort of walks and other sort of outdoor activities. And animals are a really key protective factor as well for many of the young people. So they seem to provide a sense of kind of connection and safety and a way to connect without some of the complications associated with people. So without those sort of socializing related demands, socializing related sort of negative social experiences. So this young person says, I just really love connecting with nature. I feel like nature can't hurt me. And I love animals. I love going to see animals when I'm upset. They're innocent and they're not going to hurt me. And similarly, this other young person says, bunnies are someone to talk to who don't judge. And hobbies and interests could also be a source of kind of both freedom but also predictability. So young people often had really strong interests. And they were really important for boosting well-being as well as serving as distractions when young people were feeling anxious or low. So this young person says, you know, with the extracurricular activities, I might be worrying before then, but once I've done them, I forget about the worries. And hobbies and interests could be a source of kind of predictability and therefore emotional safety, but they could also represent kind of freedom and small ways that young people could do things in their own way. So this young person is talking about the online game Minecraft, and she says, Minecraft has endless possibilities, so I can log out of that world and into another one. So just this idea of a sense of kind of freedom and possibility. Okay, so that's the end of the themes. So just to kind of summarize, so autistic young people often face significant issues with anxiety and depression, and this might sometimes be the result of unaccommodating environments and pressure to meet neurotypical expectations. Autistic young people can feel pressure to adapt to meet neurotypical demands, including academic, social, and sensory demands, and these can sometimes be internalized and impact self-esteem. So there's a few different environmental factors that could be important targets for interventions. So for example, kind of revising academic expectations, adjusting parenting styles, boosting understanding of autism among various different people, so family, teachers, peers, mental health professionals, and also providing access to kind of hobbies, interests, and low sensory demand spaces. And just a couple of things to kind of bear in mind about the data. So there was obviously quite limited kind of ethnic and socioeconomic diversity among those we spoke to. So the findings might have a bit less relevance for those with backgrounds that are less represented in the study. And in particular, the sample really sort of lacked socioeconomic diversity, and obviously a lot of the kind of challenges mentioned could be really impacted by socioeconomic factors. So things like access to housing and the resources that a family has would really impact kind of the support that they have access to. And one of the inclusion criteria for the study was that young people needed to be able to express themselves in words, either in writing or spoken words, to some extent in order to take part in the study. So the findings might therefore not reflect fully the experiences of people who didn't meet that criteria. Okay, so finally, just a bit about our next steps. So as I mentioned before, we've recently just completed a process of structured consultation with autistic young and adult stakeholders. So we've shared these qualitative findings with them and discussed them with them to come up with focused quantitative research questions for our next phase of the study. So we're about to start that phase now, looking at UK birth cohort studies, exploring trajectories of anxiety and depression, and also the impact of various different environmental factors. So we're going to focus on the school environment, so particularly things like school transitions and feelings of sort of belonging and connectedness at school. Also family circumstances and kind of adapting to family transitions, as well as various aspects of peer relationships as well. Okay, so I'd just like to say thank you to everyone involved, thank you to the whole team And to all the young people and parents who took part in the study, to our wonderful stakeholder advisory panels and our funders. I have some references there in case anyone's interested. And yeah, thank you all so much for listening. And do feel free to contact me afterwards if you'd like to. So you can email me, or you can add me on Blue Sky. I've only just got Blue Sky, so I don't have many followers yet. But yeah, do follow me.
Oh, we'll come and join you on Blue Sky. Blue Sky is a lovely place. It's like Twitter was in 2015. So yeah, if you're not on Blue Sky, follow Cray on Blue Sky as well. We'll be following Sarah. We'll be making sure we magnify this stuff. And we, not this Monday, but the Monday after, we'll be hopefully posting this up on YouTube. I'll make sure that there's a transcript. We've been asked for a transcript already, Sarah. The lovely audience there. Can I say, just going to read one out. Amazing study. Great to hear so many neurospicy people being able to speak and to be listened to. Important piece of work, lots of lovely things. A few questions coming up as well. Before the questions hit, thank you for creating a piece of work that looks for insights in different ways. That actually, it's not just going to be these interviews are just the first step. You're then going to go on and see, because you've been analysing things alongside your participants, alongside your, you call them collaborators, which is just such a lovely word, that they're going to be helping inform where you look in the big data set as well, which is just an exciting way of doing stuff. And these three ideas of, in some ways, the heartbreaking stories of the demands, particularly around school and inflexibility, of autonomy and how you seize back control, and how parents can create boundaries, but also they can actually help people create their own ways of talking about their own lived life that can become self-advocacy. And then these ideas of safety, and as practitioners, how we create places of trust. I will say, I was fascinated towards the end to hear not just about online friendships, but the joy and freedom of Minecraft. Sometimes parents buy into the story that all social media is evil and you should get off the games. Actually, there is a function in there. We're not saying game all the time. Well, you can when you've got a proper job and you can afford it. But while you're still at school and you've got other things to do, these things mitigate some of the risks of our environment by having virtual environments. And when we're not doing those wonderful games, we can get out into nature, meet the bunnies. You had a picture of a bunny. I squealed. It was absolute joy. So I've got a few questions. We've only got 5-6 minutes to do it. Can I thank you ever so much on behalf of everyone who's been with us here today, on behalf of Cray. You are doing brilliant research. Wish everybody else a great evening. I hope you have a lovely, lovely time. You enjoy the sunshine while it's out and you enjoy the shade when it creeps in. Look after yourselves. So many thank yous in the chat. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Graham. Thank you for having me.
Have yourselves a lovely day. Oh, so many people saying brilliant work. Oh, isn't that so lovely? Take care, people. Look after yourselves. Bye.
Bye.